Thank you. Thank you. It's kind of interesting looking around, in particular at the faculty here, because I think I've been involved in hiring of everybody, which is what happens if you've been around for a while. But I remember my first year, we were looking at Ken's CV and talking to him and being wowed by him, so it goes back. So speaking of things that have been going on for a while, for the past 60 years or so, generative linguists have been using the concept of, let me get introduction. Have been using the concept of universal grammar, taking this concept of a genetic endowment specific to language as central in the driving our research questions and the way we interpret data. The alternative that I'm exploring is what I call emergent grammar. The view that many of the grammatical properties that we find in languages are due to general human cognitive abilities and not to something that is specific to the that is a specific component for language. Then what that would mean is that the residue, the things that we cannot account for by general cognitive abilities, would be the purview of a universal innate endowment that is specific to language. So this hypothesis then that language is acquired with only minimal benefit from an innate language-specific endowment demands that we identify what the properties are, the cognitive abilities that we are going to assume, at least at the outset, are helping drive language. And I, starting point at least, taking three different abilities given very succinctly here as similarity, frequency, and what I call the symbolic imperative. The idea of similarity is that as humans we're able to identify two different tokens of something as tokens of the same thing or instances of the same thing, whether that is that one cup of tea and another cup of tea are both cups of tea, or one day that I come into the classroom and another day that I come into the classroom, it's Diana Archangeli doing that on both days, so on. We use this concept of similarity and grouping things together into more abstract categories as companies do all the time, and we're not continually surprised because everything is new every time we encounter it. Frequency is the idea that the more often we encounter something, the more likely we are to take note of it, remember it, and have it as part of our mental representations of the world. The symbolic imperative then is this force that drives us to not remember or not represent what we encounter as instances, as sort of one-off instances, but rather to group them together into a more abstract representation, to take those abstract representations and create even more abstract representations or more symbolic representations, and continue to do this process with no clear stopping point, just as long as it still works for us. So those are the three basic elements that I'll be working with. And the idea then is that the complexities of language emerge as the learner encounters language data, makes use of these general algorithms that we use in all walks of life, and that these are not language, that is, these are not language specific. So in what I'm talking about today, although I've called this emergent grammar in my title here, I'll be talking specifically about sound systems. And the three phenomena that I'll be looking at are what I call the mapping problem, which is, we'll be looking at how we get to segments and features, categorical behavior, that will be an example of patterns, and then the systems, which is that the particular phonological phenomenon that develops in some phonological systems is something called derivational opacity. So I'll be looking at these three and tying them back into these notions of similarity, frequency, and symbolizing things. So starting out then with segments and features. What the problem is. The basic problem is something that's faced by both theories, both universal model and an emergent model, that we have to map the real-world continuous information that we encounter to some kind of discrete unit. I'm taking that as a given. Of course, someone can say, no, we don't have to do that. But I'll take it as a given for today. The innatist hypothesis would say that there's an innate connection between features or segments and certain phonetic properties so that we can map these predefined discrete units to the real-world data that we encounter. This would be consistent with the concept of phonetic invariance, that the mental representation that we're born with has some invariant phonetic properties that allow us to identify it whenever we come across it. The emergent grammar says that the connection between these abstract elements and the real-world data is something, yes, we need to do, but it's determined individually based on the data that we encounter. So an example of this comes from work that I did with Adam Baker and Jeff Melke. We were actually interested in the phenomenon in English where some people will retract S in STR clusters and say something that sounds much more like stra instead of stra, like street instead of street. I always thought of this as mush mouth, and then I discovered that I do it a lot myself. So now I think it's the right way. But the two groups of people then, those who have the stra sound, the S in that sequence we call non-retractors, and those that have a stra sound we call retractors. And what's interesting in looking at centroid frequencies of these is that the three sounds have different centroid frequencies. The esh is quite low, the S is high, and the S in an STR cluster is in between. What's interesting is comparing this to the case of retractors, who also have that three-way distinction with the S in the STR being between that of an S without the TR and an esh wherever it shows up. But what's also interesting in looking at this is when we look at what those centroid frequencies are. So we see that the bar here for the retractors is right around 7,000 hertz, whereas for the non-retractors, it's a little bit higher, about 7,500. They also have a wider bar. The esh, on the other hand, is down close to 4,000, whereas here it's 4,500, 4,600. And the esh is much closer to the esh, the S in STR is much closer, much lower in the retractors than it is in the non-retractors. Yes, sir?
I'm really sorry. I missed what the definition of retractor is.
It's the ones that sound like sh instead of s.
So it's a perceptual distinction?
Yeah. So, and what's interesting is when you look at all the numbers, and you can see by this, there is overlap. So people that are perceived as S can be down as low as the ones that are perceived as esh. But what's interesting sort of more broadly in thinking about English is that we class these, even though they have very different properties, we class eshes as eshes and s's as s's. We don't have 4 categories, and some people use 2 of them and others use a different 2. So this is just a kind of example that is repeated time and time again throughout phonetic work, that the phonetic properties are not invariant when we look at how they map to the segments and features that we want them to map to. So the interim conclusion that we can come to from this is a prediction made from a universalist model is that we should get complete invariance. From emergence, we don't necessarily have that, and we find that the facts line up with emergence. But the question then that comes is, well, how do you do this? If you don't have categories to start with and you're encountering all of this information, how is it that you line things up and say, okay, these actually not only are tokens of the same thing, but they have a property that they share that we can call on when we need to for the patterns we find. So this is where the idea of similarity comes in, and finding as we encounter different sounds, we're able to group them by the properties that they have. So that we have various sounds in the top row, we've got sound 1.1, sound 1.2, sound 1.3, which all have some silence, different degrees of silence, a long VOT, the tongue tip is involved, and so on. So we can even though we don't have categories to put things in, by observing the data that we're exposed to, we can make generalizations about the properties they have. And this would give us a leg up in mapping these to specific categories, again, sounds 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, I've given the typical IPA symbol for sounds that might correspond to these because that's very helpful for us to know what we're talking about. But it's not I don't want those to be thought of as the model is giving you these, or the grammar is giving you these, and this is what you're trying to map to. Rather, these are emerging from categorizing the data you're encountering based on its properties, based on the similar properties among different groups of sounds. So what we can conclude based on the similarity principle in particular is that segments can be identified as certain clusters of sounds that have that sound similar to each other, and so they might merit a single mental representation. Features then would be these properties, again, that are identified as similar, and again might merit a shared mental representation. Now, so far I've based this only on physical properties, but we know that patterns can also, that we find patterns in languages, and I think that these can also contribute to how we class things as similar. That is, they don't necessarily have to be similar, or they may be similar in behavior, but things can also be they may be similar in how they're perceived, but they can also be similar in how we produce them. They can also be similar in how they pattern. And so these would be different ways, different types of evidence that the language learner could use to be determining what the relevant properties are that we want to use in classifying our sounds. A second caveat is this notion of meriting a single mental representation. What it means is that this is something that is a candidate for being represented as a category, but it doesn't mean that it necessarily perseveres into the grammar. That is, there are probably, I'm imagining that there are a lot of things that we can pay attention to at some point that we don't say, oh, that has to be part of our grammar. So as an example of this, something that we know we pay attention to, and that in fact even as adults we pay attention to, is who said it. And we can, anybody can pick up a phone and somebody says hello, and if you know the person, quite often just from one word, you know who the speaker is because you've paid attention to properties of their voice. But that doesn't mean that properties that distinguish whether it's me or Natasha or someone else answering the phone is something that we represent in our grammar. It just means that is something that we have the capacity to identify. So an infant may early on be able to be representing who says what, and not knowing whether this is part of grammar or not, but very quickly deciding this doesn't matter as far as the language business is concerned. So now moving on to the the section on patterns. And one of the things that is kind of interesting for me to think about in this regard is the fact that the language learner is dealing with imperfect data. That is, there's nobody that comes along and says, okay, you now have enough data to figure this out. Nobody's setting up the phonology problem for the language learner like we do when we're giving phonology problems to our students. So, and yet people are, hypotheses get made. And so one of the assumptions I'm working with is that we can make hypotheses based on the input data that don't have to hold of every item that we've encountered. We can make hypotheses about subsets of the data. Examples of systematic subsets that we know are relevant in languages are things like the subsets of consonants. So in English, we have this aspiration process that aspirates stops in certain positions. The set of stops that is aspirated is not all stops. It's just the voiceless ones. So that's a subset. We make a generalization about a subset of the data. Similarly, it's a subset of the environments. It's only word initially and before stressed vowels. It's not anywhere voiceless stops occur, but only in specific places. So this concept of subsets is something that we make use of continually. We also have random subsets. They don't have to be things that are determined by sensible properties like position in a word or something. Things like the Bantu noun classes, where there's I don't know, 20-some of them, and some nouns are this class and some nouns are that class, and so far nobody's been able to come up with a principle that tells you which of these many, many noun classes a particular noun belongs to. So we use this both in terms of very systematic subsets and also in terms of random subsets. So that tells us this is something that we can learn. And so that's sort of what in the back of my mind as I start looking at patterns. Now, I think that this kind of leads into this notion of whether patterns should be general or specific. And most of the views of universal grammar in phonology that I'm familiar with all want the more general process to be more desirable. And so that the best, to have a general constraint that outranks all others and says the language is like this is a good thing. There's various principles like the Paninian principle, that comes up because sometimes specific things outrank more general things. But we want the sort of default cases, we want the more generality to be there. In SPE, this was explicitly part of the model. Your evaluation metric on how good a grammar was how few symbols you could use, how general you could make it. Emergent grammar, because of this ability that we have to make generalizations about subsets, says, okay, that's maybe how we start. We just make generalizations about little bits of the data, and if it merits, because more and more things fall into that pattern, we can make it more general, but we don't have to. So we have a difference between the two systems. Now, the place that I'm looking for evidence on this is not in the overt systems, but in the covert systems. That is, the cases where we don't have a shared phonological pattern. Because in the shared ones, there's other factors that come along, like transmission from generation to generation and so on, that might serve a simplifying role. But if it's a covert pattern that is individualized, then we might expect a chance of seeing. If we don't have external factors pushing us to make it more simple or more general, what is it that people do in that case? So just to give a sense of what I mean by covert and overt, this is an example of overt systems. This is L allophony, dark L's and light L's. It comes from work that I've done with Jeff Melke and Adam Baker. What we've got here is the basic part of the grammar is these circles correspond to constraints and the arrows down are ranking orders. The gray circle and the circle below it are the basic grammar saying either don't have a dark L is more important than not having a light L, a language that would have light L's everywhere if that's all it had. Or in the middle one, it's don't have a light L, outranks don't have a dark L, and that would be a language that had dark L's everywhere. And what we see in these cases is there's one or two constraints can outrank that basic grammar, allowing either dark or light L's, depending on which one it is, to occur in certain environments. Now this contrasts with a covert case, which is one which is not shared in the community. And this comes from English R. Now English R is well known to have multiple articulations. This figure goes back to 1968 based on X-ray data. 8 different articulations. Each of these is a consolidation of multiple different ones. It's not like people used one of these 8 and nothing else. Types 1 and 2, just for background information, are the R's of R-less dialects. I think that's cool that you can have an R if you don't have R. Types 3 through 8 are the ones that we find in America typically, and these are basically thought of, type 4 is thought of as the classic bunch and type 8 as the classic retroflex, but we can see that there's actually a variety of what these guys thought of as canonical shapes among those, the bunches and the retroflexes. So a lot of different possibilities for R. What we did in our lab was we looked at the way different U of A undergrads make their R's, and we found that while some people only use bunch and some people only use retroflex, some people use both. And this is an example of our subject number 9 that used both retroflexed and bunch. In the left-hand picture, we see the retroflex in frog with the tongue tip coming up. This bright line is the palate superimposed on the image of the tongue. And the tip of the tongue is over on the right of each of these. We can see here the tip of the tongue coming up, quite different from this case where the tongue is going down in the front. It bunches up and drops down. You don't see the tongue tip at all. So basically what we were looking at when we were making our classifications was whether the tip of the tongue goes up, as we can see it doing in 7 and 8, or whether it goes down, which is pretty much what we took all of those others to be. So we made these classifications and looked at what individuals did. We set aside those who only bunched in every environment we had. We set aside those who only retroflexed in every environment we had. We set aside the one subject who seemed to use the two articulations randomly. We could find nothing consistent in them. Of the other 11 people who used both, what we found was they were fairly systematic in where they used a bunch and where they used a retroflex. What was interesting about it, though, was nobody used the same system, and the systems were fairly elaborate. Here are examples from two people. In both cases, our basic grammar is don't bunch, outranks, don't retroflex. We chose this not because we think retroflex R is the more common thing, but rather because this gave us a simpler grammar. We still got this kind of thing. One thing that for some of you may be really cool is there's a lot of similarity, even though they're different. So for example, neither one likes a coda R, or a retroflex coda. Neither one likes esh followed by a retroflex. One difference is subject 10 doesn't like F followed by a retroflex. Subject 32 had no problem with Fs followed by retroflexes. In the other cases, we've got things like retroflex after K is not a good thing for either person. But subject 32, it's only if an ah follows. If E or O follows, it's okay. But if ah follows, the subject will bunch. Similarly with theta, in a word like throw, this subject will bunch, but in a word like 3, you'll find a retroflex. Subject 10, throw or 3, both of them are bunched. So what we find in these cases then is something very different from what we found in the overt grammars. And that is, in the overt grammars, they were very simple. These covert grammars are not driven for simplicity. The subject is figuring something, or the individual is figuring something out that works for them. If it's, a spider web mess, that's not a problem. So the conclusion we can draw from this then, general patterns are predicted in a universal grammar model. They're not predicted in the emergent model. The facts, what we find in the covert situation where there's not the external factors pushing towards simplicity, we find that, in fact, individuals are comfortable with fairly complex systems. So now what I'm looking at is combining both similarity and frequency effects, looking at segments and features and patterns together to see just what does this mean for building grammars. The example I'm starting with is flapping in English, something we all know and love. We get flapping of coronals between stressed and unstressed vowels, as shown in A through D, and there are tons of other words. And we don't get this when it's before a stressed vowel, end of word, and other environments, as shown in E through H, and again, tons of other words. So we have this flapping pattern that is easy to identify, easy to find in the data. How does this get discovered by a language learner? Well, we can add to the table that we had before, which is what we've got to the left of the right-hand double line, that's based simply on sound properties. We can add observations about where these things are found. So we would add possible environments, and these would only be some among the many that one could imagine, would be beginning of a syllable before a stressed vowel and between a stressed vowel and an unstressed vowel. And what we find when we do that is a contrast between the two types of sounds where, if we, ignoring the labials, which are just there for fun, but looking only at the tongue tip sounds, we find that 2 of them occur at the beginning of syllables. The third one does not occur in that environment. In the stressed, unstressed environment, the 2 that occurred syllable initially do not occur, whereas in that environment, that one that did not occur syllable initially does occur. So we get this complementary distribution in this restricted environment. So we can see that the same concept of identifying similarity can lead us into the locating patterns in the language. So what we might then come up with is, as the preponderance of evidence pushes us, the preponderance of evidence being the frequency counts, says, okay, these are really things to pay attention to, would be statements like 1, 2, and 3, beginning something that's starting to look more like what we might recognize as a grammar. That T and D never appear between stressed and unstressed vowels, which could then become more generally coronal stops, or whatever abstract notion you're using for coronal, never appear between stressed and unstressed vowels. Flap only appears between stressed and unstressed. Aspirated guys appear syllable initially, and so on. So we get, we're able to go from the similarities and of different types and the frequency counts to making generalizations about the language. So how do these work when we start looking at more complex systems? First point is, believe it or not, it's not all phonology. There is something else involved. And what this is talking about is that there's also, the interface that I'm looking at here is morphology. That as we encounter things, we don't simply note that there's sounds and leave it, but in fact we start assigning meanings to things, meanings to the sounds that we get, and building up mental representations of words of some sort. As this continues and the evidence gets greater and greater in the mind, we end up with observations like, I have multiple instances that sound like bat, a stressed syllable with an unreleased T at the end. I can group those together. I can group all those observations together as a single type, bat, that stands for all of the specific instances of different people saying this. Similarly with bats and with batting, and we get, subtracting away the suffixes, we get a morpheme that has 3 different pronunciations that means bat. And so that's what's represented. The more symbolic type is represented in this way, where what's similar is abstracted out from the parts that are different. There are a lot of other words like this, pat, note, rate, and so on. These items ending with voiceless coronals. So this leads then to morphological generalizations, which make use of the sounds, but which are not generalizations about the phonology specifically, rather about the structure of words that get put into the lexicon. If there's a morpheme final T, for instance, then we also expect to find a morpheme final unreleased T, as well as the plain T, as well as the flap. If there's a morpheme final unreleased T, we expect to find the morpheme final unreleased T along with the morpheme final plain T and a morpheme final flap. The same sort of thing can be done for morpheme final D and unreleased D. When we come to discovering a morpheme final flap, however, the generalization is different because we don't know whether it corresponds to the voiceless or the voiced guy. And so we end up with a more broad morphological generalization, that it can be either the T set or the D set, but it doesn't mix the two. It has those two as separate sets. So the same type of thing then can be applied to affixes, where you get this is the English past tense, where you get the T, the D, and the ud endings, and how these all can be understood at some point as being recognized as being the past tense. So the morpheme for the past tense has 3 physical possibilities, and that gets grouped together in the morphology. So under emergence, then, we have morphology as morphemes represented as sets of allomorphs with generalizations about the forms of allomorphs. That is, these have to go together because of the symbolic imperative. That is, the idea that I'm working under here is that when you recognize that there is similarity, you are forced to go to a more symbolic representation. So you can't simply stop with bunches of allomorphs. You go on beyond that and create a symbolic representation that has this more general statement, such as if you have a morpheme final T, you have these other things as well, or you expect to find these other things as well. Phonology gives us generalizations about where the sounds occur. The grammar then puts these two together and uses the phonology to determine which of the various allomorphs will show up in a particular environment by selecting the one whose sounds fit the phonological generalizations that we've got in the phonology. So one of the advantages I see of this is that this builds into the system that the more frequently you encounter phenomena, the more stable that phenomenon will be in your language. So as you're learning something, if you encounter aspirated stops in particular environments, where you find these left, right, and center, you go, okay, this is something I want to keep track of. On the other hand, if you discover the first 3 words you learn start with M, and you make a generalization that words start with M, you very quickly don't have a lot of frequency building up in that generalization, because there's so many words in our language that don't start with M. And so that would be a case where the words start with M generalization would not be stable, whereas the aspirate your stops in a particular environment would be very stable. A second one is that the morphological generalizations have the property of building the lexicon as you go along. So once you make the generalization that, for example, if you have a morpheme final T, then you also get a form with a flap and you get a form with an unreleased T. When you don't have to wait to hear those words to use those words, because you have your morphological generalization that you expect the morpheme to have these allomorphs. When you then take that morpheme that you got just from one environment and plunk it into a different environment, your morphological and phonological generalizations will fill in the blanks and let you build your grammar that way. So this has been focused so far on morphological and phonological interactions, and now I want to move towards phonological interactions, looking at Canadian raising. And this is where the notion of derivational opacity slips in. So the general pattern with Canadian raising is diphthongs, the 2 diphthongs I and ow, are raised let me just say, the name Canadian raising is not because this occurs only north of the border, but they got credit for it. So we talk about Canadian raising, but it occurs in a lot of dialects of American English as well. But the basic phenomenon is you get the diphthongs I and ow raised before voiceless consonants. The theoretical interest of this has gone on for quite some time. It was brought up as an example of critical rule ordering that you have to, because of the way it interacts with the flapping rule. Flapping, if you think back on what we were just talking about, creates from a voiced stop from a voiceless stop creates a voiced flap. So now a diphthong in a word like right, if you add ing to it, you end up with a voiced flap, and you get the potential then for either the raised or the unraised variant before this voiced flap. And if it's the raised variant, you now have a raised form before a voiced flap where you expected the unraised form because it's voiced. That was kind of confusingly said. I hope it was clear. Hopefully, if it wasn't clear, it will become clear as we look at more examples. So this was used in classical generative phonology to motivate critical rule ordering of things, that you have to do your raising before you do your flapping to get this to work out. In optimality theory, you have this surface violation of a raised diphthong before a flap, before a voiced flap, so the raising is something that we think of as a markedness constraint taking place on the surface, and yet the trigger is not there. The trigger was something in the input that is no longer there. So it's this notion of derivational opacity that's been a thorn in the side of optimality theory for a while. So the basic pattern in monomorphemic words here is shown. We've got above the line the front diphthong, and below the line the back I and ow. The left-hand side shows with voiceless consonants, and the right-hand side shows with voiced. So you get things like tripe and tribe. Do you do this, Andrew? So yeah, much clearer than most people I hear. And so we get this contrast between the vowels that goes along with the voicing of the following consonant. So how does the morphology treat this? Well, You know, you hear a bunch of tokens of cry, you represent it as cry. You hear a bunch of tokens of rouse, you represent it as rouse. And then you get tripe with the raised oi, you would represent it that way. I don't do this well, so I shouldn't say them at all. But you would only be hearing the raised or the unraised variant, and so you would be driven to representing these in terms of what you're hearing. So your morphological generalizations would be really dull. If you have I, you've got I. If you've got ow, you've got ow. If you've got you've got and so on. Nothing exciting going on there. Flapping is where this gets interesting because the raising stays with the morpheme. It doesn't matter if it's raised without flapping, it's raised with flapping. So we get writes and writing versus rides and riding. So we get these minimal pairs based on the flap. So that's the big issue with this stuff. So when we look at the bigger picture of now we have bringing in the different pronunciations of the final consonant, it's just putting together what we've seen before. We have the vowel doesn't vary, so we would have a initial consonant if there is one, the vowel that doesn't vary, and then the options for the final consonant when it's this coronal at the end of the word, and we get different representations for write and ride. The phonological distribution of the raised and unraised diphthongs then shows up as, and is you know, I'm saying this, but this is something that can be taken directly from what you're exposed to, that if it's at the end of a word or before a voiced element, you get either if it's at the end of the word or before something that's voiced, you'll get the non-raised version. If it's before something voiceless, you get the raised version. If it's before a flap, you can get either one. And that's our phonological generalizations. Any of the four diphthongs show up before flap. Only the raised ones show up before voiceless, and the unraised ones show up if it's not voiceless. So this is a summary then of the basic analysis that we have in the top left our phonological generalizations that we went through before about flapping, and about on the right-hand side about the diphthongs showing up in these different environments. Below the line we have the morphological generalizations where with the stops we have multiple options. With the vowels we don't. It's just the vowels are the vowels. Nothing exciting there. And it's the interaction depending on which morphemes you put together that creates different environments that tells you which of the allomorphs to pick based on which is going to satisfy both what your options are and what the phonology gives you as your directives. Compare this to the classical generative analysis of rule ordering. In these cases, one of the assumptions made was these have the same vowel to start with. There is a process of raising. So if you've got the same vowel to start with, you have to have a rule that raises. It will only apply if there's a following voiceless stop. So that's the second row, the raising row right here. Doesn't apply if it's voiced. Stress applies, giving us stress on the first vowel. Flapping applies, and that gives us the raised diphthong before the flap and the non-raised diphthong before the flap, giving us this contrast that's been so puzzling. Okay. But there's a problem, and that is that there are diphthongs that show up that as raised in different dialects that shouldn't show up because it's a voiced stop, or voiced sound. So before R's, raised front diphthongs do occur for some speakers. Before L's, raised back diphthongs occur for some speakers. This shouldn't happen under the standard picture because there's no voiceless thing to trigger this raising. The phonological generalizations under the emergent model simply need to add, for speakers of this sort, that it's okay to have the raised diphthong before L, the raised back diphthong before L, and the raised front diphthong before R, and otherwise it stays the same. It doesn't require it, but it says this is an okay thing to do. A second problem is there are other unexpected raised diphthongs. There are some words that for a number of speakers are raised that always have a flap. There's no alternation, so words like miter and title. Words like bridle and sidle are unraised. Now we look at these and go, oh, well, that's a spelling pronunciation, but what has been found is in the words spider and cider, there are some speakers who raise even in that environment, even though it doesn't go along with the spelling pronunciation. So what we're finding is raised diphthongs do occur before voiced elements that are never voiceless, or that we don't have reason to think of as voiceless because they are in no way, shape, or form showing up as voiceless in some other morphological context. So what does the classic generative account have to do here? Well, either it throws up its hands in despair, or it comes up with a solution that miter, for example, has a T in it that gets flapped, and this accounts for that pattern. That works okay for these guys if you're happy to have a more abstract input representation for something that never surfaces, that never surfaces as voiceless. And many people, in earlier incarnations of myself, I'd be totally happy with this. But the R case is more difficult because we don't have a voiceless R. And yet, if we want to say this is the same vowel and it's surfacing as raised before certain R's, we're forced to say we have a voiceless R and a voiced R in English. It's the voiceless R we know because it induces raising, and then it gets voiced by a neutralization that all R's are voiced in English. And so that process would give it, those representations would give us the desired output at the cost of moving the abstraction about the nature of the diphthong in this case into properties of the R rather than into the properties of the word or properties of the vowel. So that I see would be the classic generative solution to this, which I don't think is desirable. But let's move on to looking at an optimality theoretic model. This is based on work by Jeff Melke and Beth Hume, where basically there's properties of their proposal that are very similar to ours in that they are putting the distinction in the vowel. And you can see that very quickly by looking at that highest rank constraint in their tableaus is faith vowel. So if you've got the lowered diphthong, you're going to have that lowered diphthong in the output because faith vowel is top ranked. What may change is whether you have a T or a D after it. Their constraints higher V and low V have to do with wanting higher V's before voiceless things and lower V's before voiced things. So in this case where you have the lower V before a voiceless thing in the input, the totally faithful candidate is ruled out because it doesn't have a lower V, or because it does have a lower V before the voiceless thing and it wants to have a lower V before a voiced thing. So it gets thrown out. The voiced consonant is preserved. It only violates ident voice. And the other two candidates are thrown out quickly because of faith vowel. Similarly, if you have a voiceless consonant, if you have a raised vowel with that voiceless consonant, the raised vowel candidates are kept, the lowered vowel candidates are thrown out immediately. Of those two, then, it's higher V and lower V that pick the one that has the raised vowel followed by the voiceless consonant as the winner. So their model is driven by the quality of the vowel. And what this shows, and I'll just skip it in interest of time, but what these tableaus show is if you have a voiced consonant instead of a voiceless consonant in the input, it's still the vowel that drives which of the candidates is selected as optimal. And this one then shows if you have the lower V with a voiced consonant or the raised V with a voiced consonant and the flapping environment, the second rank constraint that avoids foot medial T and D results in the flap. So that's going to throw out the faithful candidates and get us the flap. And then faith V is going to keep whichever vowel it was in the input as the input vowel, or as the output vowel. So that gives us a contrast between writing and writing. So what are some problems with the optimality solution? Well, the first problem is there are some alternations with raising. There are not very many of them, but they do exist. In addition to the voiced labial plural set that we see here, the wife-wives cases, and then the mouth-mouthing cases, we also have things like die and dice, where the singular is the singular of die is word final, and the plural is before a voiceless consonant, and it is raised. If you want to classify those as having the same input form and somehow having something phonological going on, you have you have the problem of an alternation in that vowel. These are all problems for the optimality count, because the optimality count has faith V as the top rank constraint, because it basically wants to rule this out as a possibility. So possibilities in the emergence model, when you encounter data of this sort, you would say, well, for these morphemes, we've got two vowels as well as the two consonants, and I will select the best vowel and best consonant pair given my phonological generalizations. The optimality count, the crux of their analysis is that faith V outranks all else. So words like wife and wives, the diphthong does alternate, and so for these words, faith V can't dominate all else. So you're forced to an analysis where either this is something totally separate from the other raising business, or which is not what it feels like, at least. So to summarize, then, the general pattern of the facts is that, in general, we get a higher diphthong before voiceless consonants and a lower diphthong before voiced ones in word finally, but there are exceptions. There's a systematic exception before flaps, and there's these various sort of anomalous morphological patterns. Under emergence, the generalizations on the distribution of flaps and of diphthongs are based both on the morphological patterns and on the phonological patterns. So we have morphemes with their various allomorphs encoded, we have phonological patterns encoded, and the two work together to determine what is going to be the actual pronunciation in a given environment. The rule-based analysis either has to give up on the diphthong generalization as a rule, or it has to introduce absolute neutralization of things like the voiceless R. The constraint-based analysis has the challenge of dealing with the few cases where there is an alternation, which in things like wife and wives, which they don't want to, because that violates the faith vowel, which is their top rank constraint. So what we see then is both models are capable of expressing phonological generalizations. Under universal grammar, we don't really have, at least in the phonological side of things at least, we don't have morphological generalizations about the shape of morphemes encoded as such. We have an input representation, and whatever the phonology ends up being for the optimal output representation is a result of the phonology and not something that's encoded as part of the morphology. So there aren't generalizations drawn about what allomorphs are possible under at least an OT model or a classical generative model. And then the UG model, whether it's the rule-based model or the optimality theoretic model, has problems with derivational opacity, which at least in this case we're seeing that the emergent model does not have. So, to discuss and conclude. What I started with was a very brief statement of a conceptual problem that if we don't seriously consider alternative possibilities for things that we find in grammars, if we don't seriously consider the emergent possibilities as the source for those, we can't really be sure that when we say, oh, this is part of universal grammar, that we've really come up with a principle that should be there, because maybe there is an alternative source. There's different ways to approach it, or to approach this problem, and the method that I'm choosing here is to look at it in terms of let's abandon as much as we can of universal grammar and try to do everything without it and see where we end up. The mapping problem was the first one we looked at concretely, which is the mapping between sounds and features, and we see that this is highly dependent on properties of individual languages. It's not something that has the properties that we would expect to find in a system that's driven by universals. And when we looked at patterns, we found that individuals organize patterns very, they don't, there's not a drive towards simplification when it's up to the individual to do the organization, that individuals are comfortable with very messy looking sound patterns. When we looked at phonological systems, what I tried to show today is that it is possible to look at some fairly complex phonological facts and create at least the beginning of a grammatical system that accounts for those facts using only the emergent principles to get there. We looked at the case of Canadian raising and what I argued was that the emergent account actually handles the data better than either a rule-based or an optimality theoretic model. And the challenge of derivational opacity in particular was shown to be a non-problem under the emergent model, at least in this case, that the phenomenon emerges as an effect of the interplay of the phonological and morphological generalizations and doesn't merit further discussion. It's kind of a side effect. So to conclude then, I think that we really do need to explore the emergent hypothesis very seriously as we look at phonological systems. That before moving to the position that, oh, I found another universal, to say, okay, could this actually result from just general cognitive possibilities, cognitive abilities? And what is interesting to me and kind of exciting and absolutely terrifying is I have no idea where this is going to end up. What the model will look like is something that, you've seen my early efforts at it, and there's some other papers floating around that I've been part of, but it's not the case that this is an effort that is working with a preconceived notion of this is what the grammar will look like, how do we get there if we assume the emergent principles as the starting point, but rather if we assume the emergent principles as a starting point, what is the grammar that we end up with? What does that formal model look like? And that's what, as I said, is quite terrifying, but also very entertaining for me to think about. An aspect of it that I really like is that this is forcing me to think about parts of linguistics that haven't been central to my research for most of my career. Experimental research, which I've started in recently in my lab, but there's a lot more to it than I know anything about, is critical. Looking at both the trying to tease apart what is a morphological generalization from a phonological generalization is not something I've really worried about. I've started doing computational modeling. It's not on here, but language acquisition stuff is obviously extremely relevant here, and it drives me to the position of thinking of I have to think of myself as a linguist, not as a phonologist, because I can't. This model is saying you don't want to have boundaries around your subdiscipline. You need to be integrated with everything if you're trying to account for what language does. References, and thank you.